All right. So thank you very much, colleagues, and welcome. We are honored to have Dr. Tefazo Choto from Midlands State University, who is going to be presenting to us today on a very interesting presentation and study on cricket and politics, the intersections between cricket and politics. So let me quickly introduce our speaker. Dr. Tafazo Choto is a lecturer in the Department of Community Studies at Midland State University in Zimbabwe. His research interests revolve around the sociology. If you can see it on your end, I think we can just start. When you move to the second slide, then you can just let me know. Then I'll move to the second slide.
I think it's fine. I think we can start that way. But are you seeing me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much. Okay. So I'll just be indicating the next slide, the next slide, the next slide. Okay.
Oh, okay.
Thank you. Okay. So the title of my discourse is A Nation of Gentlemen, Robert Mugabe and Cricket in Post-Colonial Zimbabwe. So basically, we are trying to discuss the impact of Robert Mugabe on the development of cricket, how his politics intersected with the development of cricket in the context of post-colonial Zimbabwe. Now, the question would come, why, next slide, please, why would we look at Robert Mugabe? Robert Mugabe was the longest serving leader of Zimbabwe. He served for 36 years, and he left a complicated legacy, a very complicated legacy. But one unique thing about Mugabe that has been underexplored is that he was fond of cricket. Actually, he was the patron of the Zimbabwe Cricket Union, later known as Zimbabwe Cricket, from around 1981 to the time of his deposing in 2017. And in one of his well-known quotes, he said that cricket civilizes people, and I want ours to be a nation of gentlemen. So it is from this statement that this presentation borrows its title, the idea that Mugabe's vision of cricket being an instrument to civilize the country, transforming into a nation of gentlemen. How does that align with his political approach, and what is the impact of that on the development of the game in the Zimbabwean context? Next slide, please. Now, this research was guided by two primary research questions. The first is, how did Robert Mugabe's politics impact the development of cricket in post-colonial Zimbabwe? That's the first question we grapple with. The second, which adds from this one, how can colonial cultural capital forms be weaponized by post-colonial leaders? So this is a broader question that speaks into the broader implications of our discussions in regards to post-colonial politics in a broader sense. Now, next slide, please. First of all, we have to understand Mugabe, the man and his politics, because if we understand Mugabe and his politics, it will help us situate that into the context of cricket and how it is intersected with cricket. So Mugabe was born in February 1924 in Kutama. Now Kutama is a village in rural Mashonaland, Zimbabwe. And near that village, there was a Jesuit missionary station. And it is because of the influence of one Irish Jesuit priest, Jerome O'Hare. O'Hare introduced Mugabe to, he was his patron in terms of he paid for his fees, and he enabled him to access an education, which was something very rare during those days for African boys. But because of O'Hare's patronage, Mugabe managed to have an access to education. But not only did he access education, O'Hare introduced Mugabe to Irish revolutionary literature. from the Irish Revolution. So it is from these interactions with Oye that Mugabe was introduced to the literature of revolution, which eventually evolved into Marxist socialism, because he then went to 40A. 40A is the cradle of African nationalism. That's where a lot of African nationalist politicians cut their teeth from, and he interacted with such, and that's where he was inducted into this socialist Marxist perspective. Then from then on, he moved to Ghana at the Kwame Nkrumah Ideological Institute. That's where it also solidified his interactions with Marxist socialism. So from Ghana, I came back to Zimbabwe, where he began to practice as a teacher, but then he became involved in African nationalism. And his involvement with African nationalism led to his imprisonment, but he eventually became the leader of ZANU, the Zimbabwe African National Union. So the Zimbabwe African National Union was one of the two guerrilla formation, African nationalist guerrilla formations that was fighting against the Rhodesian government. And so he became the leader of ZANU in 1974. Next slide, please. So ZANU, through its military wing, ZANLA, the Zimbabwe African National Liberation Army, waged a guerrilla war against the Rhodesian regime. And the war eventually ended with the Lancaster House Agreement in 1980. The Lancaster House Agreement facilitated for the holding of elections in February 1980, which were won by Mugabe. Mugabe becoming prime minister in April 1980. That's where the country transitioned from minority rule to majoritarian rule. At independence in 1980, Mugabe surprisingly adopted a policy of reconciliation, where he adopted a notion of tolerant rhetoric. This was primarily motivated by economic concerns, because you would realize that the Rhodesian economy, the colonial economy, was in the hands of the minority white. They were the ones who controlled the agriculture, the manufacturing, the mining. So in order to avoid capital flight, there was this adoption of this reconciliation process. So this reconciliation process was intended to at least prevent the flight of white capital. In the early 2000s, however, there was a shift in terms of Mugabe's policy. There was the fast track land program. We discussed about this when we discussed it in the context of cricket, but then it led to Zimbabwe being isolated internationally, and also resulted in a political and economic crisis that continued to exist until he was deposed in 2017. So it's basically a historiography of Robert Mugabe's life as the leader of Zimbabwe. Next slide, please. But for our purpose sake, we need to theorize Robert Mugabe's politics, because this theoretical understanding is critical for our subject of discussion this afternoon. So there have been two primary thoughts that have been proposed to try and understand Mugabe's political thought and practice. The first one, by Rapopoulos and Savitson, they say that Mugabe's politics was characterized by a pragmatic approach, shifting between anti-colonial ideology and economic realism. So there was this tension. So his political approach was to try and navigate this tension. He had anti-colonial ideologies, but he also had economic realism. So they would argue that in the first leadership, economic realism prevailed, but in the last half, post the 2000 fast track land reform program, anti-colonial ideology prevailed. But then there is also another school of thought that says that Mugabe's political practice was characterized by a simultaneous deployment of anti-colonial rhetoric. So there was anti-colonial rhetoric, but it was also simultaneously deployed alongside neo-colonial practice. that was anchored around political survival. That's Gachenian law of 2009. So Gachenian law proposed a theory that is known as Mugabeism, whereby he says that Mugabe was motivated by political survival. Therefore, his rhetoric was mostly populist. It was anti-colonial. There was a marked departure between his rhetoric and his practice. So that's what Mugabeism speaks about. All these theories seem to feed into Homi Bhabha's concept. Homi Bhabha is a post-colonial theorist. Concept of the idea that the post-colonial state characterized by tensions. On one hand, there are attempts to mimic practices that have been inherited from the colonial powers, but there are also attempts to try and differentiate. So because of this ambivalent state, there are always tensions surrounding the post-colonial state. So it would be Bhabha's concept of mimicry and ambivalence that would be critical in terms of our understanding of how the colonial construct played a critical role within the post-colonial experience of Zimbabwe. Next slide. Now, we go to the origins of cricket. Now, the history of cricket in colonial Zimbabwe, the history of cricket in colonial Rhodesia begins with British colonialism around the 1890s. So the first recorded game was in present-day Masvingo, Fort Victoria in 1894. And the Pioneer Column, which was a group of mercenaries that were hired by Cecil John Rhodes, where Cecil John Rhodes is the one who founded the British South Africa Company. Basically, he was an imperialist and he was motivated by capitalism, the idea to acquire gold reserves in Mashonaland. So the group that he established to facilitate that process was called the Pioneer Column. So members of the Pioneer Column, among them were members who started to play cricket. So in 1894, that's when the first recorded cricket match was played. But then sports clubs, cricket clubs started to develop. And as they developed, eventually cricket became integrated with South Africa through the Currie Cup. Okay, so there was this integration between Rhodesian cricket and South African cricket. And this influence of South Africa, especially after 1948 with the establishment of apartheid, it influenced in terms of how cricket in Rhodesia became racially segregated, although it was less overt as opposed to the case in South Africa, but it became a predominantly white sporting enterprise. That's according to Novak 2012. And it also served, socially it served as a site of social accommodation. We have to appreciate that the settlers who colonized Zimbabwe, they came from different ethnic, although white, they came from different ethnic backgrounds. So there was the need to create a distinct Rhodesian identity, and sport was one of the mechanisms that helped to facilitate the creation of that identity. So cricket served as an important site of social acculturation. These white, the white minority settlers, they were dispersed, they were geographically isolated in various farming communities. So cricket served as that point of contact. They would meet, they would play cricket in these clubs that were established. So cricket was very critical for both Rhodesian identity as well as a form of acculturation for the white minority. And beyond that, if we look at studies concerning cricket's colonial interactions, it was also critical for the ideology of empire, because empire was not just a political project, but it was also a cultural project that was intended to disperse British values throughout the colonial territories. And cricket was one of the means by which these British values, the values of manhood, the values of gentlemanship, were propagated throughout the territory. So cricket, at its core, is a colonial construct, and it is attached to these colonial values. Let's go to the next slide. But there was a development that happened in 1965. In 1965, Zimbabwe, it was not yet Zimbabwe then, it was still Rhodesia. They adopted the UDI, Unilateral Declaration of Independence. This was a response to attempts by the Harold Wilson government because Harold Wilson's Labour government had wanted to give independence to colonized territories. So in response to that, the Rhodesian government, the Southern Rhodesian government declared independence from Britain in 1965 and created the country of Rhodesia. And in response, Harold Wilson and his government initiated a series of steps to internationally isolate Rhodesia. And part of that involved sanctions, and the sanctions extended to sport. So you realize that Rhodesia was isolated from the rest of the world. A lot of literature there's a lot of literature on that. Novak writes about that. Even John T. Winchie writes about that as well. So it was isolated, and it was mostly dependent on South Africa for sporting contacts. This pariah status ended with independence in 1980. So independence changed the status of sport within the territory known as Zimbabwe after it had been isolated prior because of the Unilateral Declaration of Independence. We can move to the next slide, please. Okay, so now we move on to our key discussions. The role of cricket in post-colonial Zimbabwe, especially how Robert Mugabe's politics influenced it. Now, after Zimbabwe gained independence, it immediately applied to join many international sporting organizations because the new government was aware of the role of sport in creating international the diplomatic role of sport. So Zimbabwe applied to join various international bodies, including the International Cricket Council. And in 1981, it was accepted as an associate member. But earlier on, I alluded to the policy of reconciliation, which was adopted soon after independence. Now, if you look at the implications of that policy when it comes to sport, particularly the white-dominated sports like cricket and field hockey, you realize that these were treated as white social enclaves. The idea was to say, okay, we need to protect white social interests so as to retain their economic support after independence. So because of that, there was the policy of the Mugabe regime was to leave these white-dominated sports in the hands of the previous Rhodesian administrators. So there was a continuity that ensured the white Rhodesian administrators. You see the same trend in field hockey, even in rugby. There was this continuity that emerged. It was one of the implications of the policy of reconciliation. And as a result of this, Zimbabwe inherited a team which was already experienced because it was in constant contact with South Africa. So they would participate. They participated in the 1983 World Cup. South Africa was not allowed to participate because there were concerns with the apartheid racial exclusion. So Zimbabwe was mostly took its place then. So it participated in the 1983, 1987, and 1992 World Cups. But then Zimbabwe became a full member of the ICC in 1992, which enabled it to play Test cricket. Can we go to the next slide, please? Now, it is during this period that cricket was termed a civilizing agent by Mugabe. Now, why is this important? This is important because Mugabe previously was an anti-colonial Marxist. Even the party that he led, ZANU, was sponsored by the Chinese. So ideologically, ZANU was a Maoist socialist movement. It espoused the ideas of Maoist socialism. Now, at independence, a kind of shift occurred. Instead of a Marxist socialism, which would emphasize the role of the state, there was this accommodation of white economic capital. So it is during that period that cricket is being defined as a civilizing agent. Now, this is rather strange because what Mugabe is essentially doing here is the very same colonial culture, colonial institutions that he purported to fight. He is embracing them and is actually redefining them as institutions, as agents of civility. Now, this approach aligns with what Homi Bhabha says in his mimicry concept, whereby the post-colonial state, to gain legitimacy from the colonizer, often is tempted to reproduce colonial cultural forms. So cricket as a cultural form here can be understood in this regard. Now, why would this be critical politically? Because the relationship with Britain was critical not only for economic support, but for international recognition during the Cold War era. Now, the Cold War era was a period of political tension. So what newly independent states like Zimbabwe needed to do in such a context was to try and align themselves, try and avoid aligning, try and by all means seek to extract economic benefits from the feuding global powers. So the relationship with Britain, as you can see from the slide, that's Mugabe and Margaret Thatcher. The relationship with Britain was critical for the post colonial state. Now, next slide, please. After the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, Mugabe in particular used cricket diplomacy to court the new British Prime Minister John Major. So John Major succeeded Margaret Thatcher, and John Major was fond of cricket. So in 1991, there was the Commonwealth Heads of Summit that was hosted in Harare, Zimbabwe. And during that summit, cricket was part of the proceedings, and John Major was involved in a cricket charity match. Mugabe was also part of the proceedings there. So John Major would later acknowledge that Mugabe is a gentleman, and he found their interactions very cordial. Now, why was this critical? Because Mugabe had a good relationship with Margaret Thatcher, and the Cold War had ended, and they needed to establish new relations with this new prime minister, and cricket diplomacy was critical. You can also see it also happening that the Foreign Office also intended to tap on this cricket diplomacy, and then it invited, it actually suggested to make Mugabe an honorary member of the MMC in London. Although this was vetoed by the Maryland Cricket Club in London, although this was vetoed by Major, but it shows that cricket diplomacy was critical during this period. Now, analytically, how can we see this? We can see that cricket it played an integral role in what I would call political performance. Because at independence, there was this idea to try and assure the West that Mugabe was a leader who was tolerant to white and Western interests. This sets Mugabe apart from his colleagues, because if you look at his colleagues like Kwame Nkrumah, for example, one of his mentors, Kwame Nkrumah really tried to set himself apart from the colonizer. They nationalized the economy, and they adopted, and he was very much interested in football, which was the sport of the masses. We also see the same for Kaunda in Zambia. He also embarked on nationalism. He nationalized the economy, and he was very much associated with football. But Mugabe adopted a very different approach. Instead of him nationalizing the economy at independence, they accommodated white interests. So Zimbabwe became a kind of like there was some form of economic continuity from colonial Rhodesia. The land remained predominantly in the hands of the white minority. The economy was controlled by the previous, the white minority had control over the economy, and they maintained control over their social enclaves like cricket. So we see a departure. Mugabe himself would dress in British attire, different from, he even discarded his pre-independence Maoist regalia. He became a British gentleman. And in 1994, he was conferred the knighthood by Queen Elizabeth. How can we understand these broader political performances? I think the motivation would be twofold. Number one, international support through the West, and the second one would be, as Cameroon has argued, to mask political atrocities. For instance, from 1981 to 1985, there were disturbances in Matebeleland, known as the Kokura-Hundi, and it was a period of, there was a lot of reprisals, political reprisals, a lot of atrocities that were committed then. But the West did not really pay attention to those atrocities, because Mugabe was a different kind of a leader. He was a leader that accommodated white interests. So cricket was part of this political performance during this first era of Zimbabwe's independence. But next slide, please. But a change happened in the 19, especially the late 1990s and the 2000s. One of the problems that Zimbabwe faced was the adoption of the structural adjustment policy. Now, in Zimbabwe, it was known as ISAP, the structural adjustment policy. Now, this structural adjustment policy basically worsened the economic situation for the majority, for the black majority. Remember, the post-independence economy was predominantly controlled by the whites. So the coming in of the structural adjustment, the IMF and the World Bank economic reforms, they actually worsened the plight of the black majority who were excluded from the economy. And because of ISAP, and the political opposition arose in the form of the movement for democratic change. It was primarily a workers' party, a labor party, that arose, and it became significant political opposition to Mugabe. And as a result of that, the political situation changed. The other development that happened was in 1997, there was an election in Britain, and the Conservatives were defeated by the Labour Party, and the new Labour government led by Tony Blair did not honor the Lancaster House commitments that had been made by the Thatcher government, which was a Conservative government, particularly to do with land to pay for compensation. And because of these developments and also pressure from the veterans of the Liberation War who were facing the pressure from the economy, Mugabe's government calculated politically and they engaged in a fast-track land reform program in 2000. Now, this was a watershed. This was a watershed moment because it resulted in a reconfiguration of Zimbabwe's relationship with the West. Because after the white farmers were removed from their land, Mugabe started to adopt a nativist kind of like rhetoric, whereby instead of them being accommodated as being citizens of Zimbabwe, they were being labeled as colonialists, and this land reform program was legitimized by rhetoric that established it as a continuation of the liberation struggle of the Third Chimrenga. And because of these political changes that happened, the West responded by imposing sanctions, which created an economic crisis, which became a political crisis because the MDC participated in 2 elections, the 2002 presidential elections, which was said to be unfair by the observers. And as a result, Zimbabwe was suspended from the Commonwealth. Eventually, Mugabe withdrew from the Commonwealth in 2003, and it created a political crisis. Now, next slide, please. Specifically concerning cricket, in 2003, Zimbabwe co-hosted the Cricket World Cup together with South Africa and Kenya. They hosted the 2003 World Cup. Now, it is during this period that cricket became directly intertwined with politics, because prior to the World Cup, the opposition MDC used the occasion to call for the boycotting of the World Cup, and they wanted to use the platform that was afforded by the World Cup to articulate their political grievances. Not only that, the Western countries, that is Britain, namely Britain, Australia, New Zealand, they also expressed their reservation against the Mugabe government and threatened to also boycott the tournament. The Mugabe regime, on the other hand, responded by a heavy-handed approach towards the opposition, who would have wanted to plan demonstrations and protests during that time. The 2003 World Cup is best remembered for the Black Armbands protest that happened, whereby 2 cricketers, Henry Olonga and Flower, protested against with what they called the death of democracy in Zimbabwe. And following that event, there was a radical change in terms of how cricket was administered. Previously, cricket was a social enclave, a white social enclave to be preserved. Now, cricket became a social enclave to be purged. There was a rhetoric to say that cricket was still a colonial sport because it was white dominated. There were attempts to indigenize the game. Attempts, by this we mean to put more black players. Proxies were appointed, more like what would happen in other sports like football, whereby the regime would indirectly run those sporting disciplines through proxies. We see that happening in cricket. Next slide, please. And the result of this was that there was a decline in performance. The teams were purged, experienced players were forced to retire, and this negatively affected the development of the game. So what we see here is that the game directly affected by the political developments that happened. So what are the conclusions that emanate from this study? The first thing is that Mugabe's relationship with sport at every point, in this sense, cricket, was shaped by political convenience rather than ideological principle. So sport was just among many instruments that Mugabe would use to score political goals. In the early years since independence, Mugabe embraced cricket as an instrument of diplomatic statecraft and racial accommodation. As we discussed, was to cultivate relations with white Zimbabweans and the British establishment so as to secure Zimbabwe's economic footing. Next slide, please. Then from 2000, this same pragmatic logic, it ended in reverse. When the political environment it transformed, cricket was transformed into a site of nativist paging, which to an extent mirrored the land reform program and the broader reconfiguration of citizenship that is from the national community. The sports-wide social exclusivity impacted the broader transformation of the game. Because it was preserved, it was preserved as a predominantly white enclave. That broader transformation that would have led to its integration was stalled because of political convenience. Game's administrative and player base, and also directly affected Zimbabwe's cricketing success. So as a result, both phases show that cricket was negatively affected. There was no real policy that was for cricket itself, aimed at cricket development, promoting cricket along the various segments of the population, to try and invest in cricket infrastructure, cricket development. These policies were absent. Cricket was just seen as political convenience, as an instrument to achieve political goals. So that marks the end of my discussion. I now leave this time to the host to questions.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you very much, Tafadzwa, for that interesting talk on the complex intersections between sport and politics. I think it's interesting in how we see cricket being used both as a space of maybe reproducing colonial hegemony, but also at the same time is a space through which people articulate resistance, as was the case with the students. I mean the players during a World Cup match, and how that also sort of shaped the ways in which diplomatic relations between Harare and London were constructed. So let me open this up to comments and questions, maybe for colleagues online, those that might have any comments or questions for Tafadzwa. Any comments or questions? Okay. Maybe as we are waiting, maybe I can kickstart the questions, and then we'll take other questions from colleagues. I like the use of Homi Bhabha and Homi Bhabha's ideas as a post-colonial thinker. And I think what Homi Bhabha argues in some of his work is that mimicry is often, the product of colonial power relations. So I just wanted to pick your brain with regards to the extent with which Mugabe was maybe consciously performing in what he was doing as a political performance, rather than maybe acting as a political strategist, like what you highlighted. In what way do we see maybe this as a very conscious political performance of mimicry, or maybe simply acting as a political strategist?
Okay, thank you so much for that question. Well, I think you've raised an important point, the issue of conscious political performance. I think these two processes are related to performance as well as with the intention of scoring political goals. Because if you look at the sudden change in terms of his rhetoric after independence, even like every aspect of what was associated with Mugabe, his dress, for instance, his affinity with London, his attempts to try and avoid nationalizing the economy, preserving white economic interests. I think the idea here is that, ones which we are discussing today, the idea here is that I think he genuinely saw the reality, that the political and economic reality that came after independence, that in order to survive politically, he had to have some sort of relationship with the West. So he tried by all means to redefine himself into this a leader who would be acceptable by the West, so that at the end of the day, the economy that would come from the West would continue. And this support was also critical for his own political survival. So I think it's part of a broader process here of performance. This is different from Kaunda, for example, Kenneth Kaunda in Zambia, because Kaunda portrays himself as this anti-colonialist, and he nationalizes the government. He does not want in any way to be associated with cultural Britishness. So I think this departure was calculated from my own perspective. It's an attempt to try and maintain a cordial relationship, which translates to political and economic benefit. In other words, I see these two processes as being related.
Okay. I see Faith. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Choto, for the interesting presentation. It was quite interesting to see how politics played such a significant role in the world of cricket. My question to you is there any other sport apart from cricket where the former President Robert Mugabe also interfered, and we saw these major shifts in support and even restrictions in that particular game, apart from cricket? I would love to hear your thoughts about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Faith. Yes, Tafazo, go ahead. You can respond as we wait for maybe other questions.
Okay. Okay, thank you so much. Now, cricket is unique in that it is a game that Mugabe expressed love for and fondness for. But there is the post-1980, the post-colonial regime in Zimbabwe treatment of sport. There are kind of like similarities. If you look at football, for example, after independence, there was this idea that football is an extension of the party, football administration. So you realize that people who are with political affiliations to the ruling party were the administration. So from independence, football was really politicized in the sense of it being a space that was controlled by the political establishment. But unlike cricket now, which was left, cricket and maybe rugby to an extent, and maybe field hockey to an extent, they were most left in the hands of the colonial administrators. I think the thinking around that time was, well, these are not really sports for they are elite sports for the elite, and their political value in terms of them mobilizing support against the regime is very limited. So the political calculation would be, okay, let's leave them with their field hockey and their cricket. Let us focus on football, because football is the sport of the masses. So I think that was the kind of thinking that existed during that time. To see that from independence up to around 2000, cricket was mostly in the hands of the white minority administrators, whilst football was always from the start in the hands of politically affiliated black administrators. But you realize that there became some sort of similarities after the 2003 World Cup, whereby I think the regime suddenly realized that cricket can also be a site of political mobilization. And therefore, there is also need to control cricket, control football. So as a result, cricket became part of the whole broader political process, whereby the administrators are, to an extent, politically sympathetic to the regime's political objectives, so as to try and control dissent and avoid creating a situation whereby sport becomes an avenue for political resistance, at least formally. So that's what I would say in your particular question.
Yeah, thanks, Tafazo. I think you are raising an interesting issue there, and I think the other issue that I wanted to also pick your brain on relates to the rupture and continuities post Mugabe. Maybe it could be something that, of course, maybe is outside your research, but in terms of the continuities and rupture in relation to the political legacy of Mugabe in the game of cricket, I think when it comes to administration, is still very much there. And I just wanted to hear from you in terms of the present state of cricket. I think if you listen and follow cricket, you would actually see that there's a period where there was this hegemonic dominance of clubs such as Takashinga, which emerged as a form of resistance to the white dominance in the sport of cricket. So I just wanted to understand your thinking, especially when you look at the claims now, where in most cases many supporters would say there's some kind of reverse racism, where there's almost like a quota system in cricket, which is now dominated by blacks. So if we are reading cricket as a text, but also as a space, can we also frame that maybe as some form of resistance and counter hegemonic resistance in the post Mugabe era? I don't know if you might want to reflect on that.
Okay, yes, thank you. Yes, let me reflect on that. I think the post-Mugabe era has also been marked by continuities and some discontinuities. Concerning cricket, the continuities on political management, I would say, less of it, it's not direct, it's indirect, of sport is continued. In 2019, actually, Zimbabwe was suspended from the ICC because of political involvement in cricket. And of course, that be reversed after the SRC had backed off Sports and Recreation Commission, which is the government arm responsible for sport. But the point being that the Mugabe legacy of this government control attempts to overtly control cricket have largely continued. It has not reverted back to the pre-2003 era whereby the cricket board was particularly independent, where it maintained their own interests. That's the first thing that I would highlight. There are continuities in regard to that. The second continuity I would also say is that the game of cricket is also increasingly becoming more politically relevant, especially considering the fact that Zimbabwe is now recording some sporting success in cricket. And because Zimbabwe is now recording some sporting success in cricket, there are a lot of people who now follow cricket. It's no longer a game that was supported only by the elites. It's now increasingly becoming like India and Pakistan, where cricket is the game of the masses. Particularly, it's because of the sporting successes that are attached to the game. And because of that, we start to see in the post-Mugabe era attempts to try and treat cricket more as a popular sport, considering that Zimbabwe will host the World Cup again in 2027, that is next year. Cricket is now occupied more political space than it would normally do because of this idea that it is now a space of political mobilization. But as you have highlighted now, there is some form of reverse racism because there is this tension that is now plaguing cricket now. Should we prioritize race over performance? There seems to be this unproven assumption that the white players are more effective, better as compared to the black players. So we should not prioritize race. We should rather prioritize merit. So these are some of the tensions that the Zimbabwe cricket, that is the governing body, has to grapple with. Particularly important is David Coulthard, an opposition mayor, who is also a cricket fan, who occasionally articulates this idea of racism within cricket, that white players are being systematically excluded from the system. So what I think is that the racial tensions in cricket have not been resolved, because cricket reached this stage was not through a process of natural assimilation, maybe as is the case in South Africa, but through a process of forced racial accommodation, which happened because of political influence. So the consequences of that process are still with us, because the realities are that there's still lack of investment in the sport. The players that you see are mostly, as you have alluded, from Takashinga, but they're also mostly from the elite schools. The majority of the schools in Zimbabwe, unlike with football, they don't play cricket. You do not see children playing cricket in the streets as you would see them playing football. So it's still much an elite sport. And it's also a very much urban sport. It's mostly followed in the urban areas. So there has been not an investment in making cricket truly a national game, so as to tap in maybe in talent from the remote rural areas, just as football would be. So those are some of the tensions that we still have. In as much as we may say that there are now more black players that are playing cricket, but there is now elitism involved. There is still exclusion, but it's exclusion that has taken another dimension. So there is need for a reconfiguration of the whole cricket system so as to allow the creation of structures and policies that really make cricket a national game, so that we are able to develop fully and invest, not just looking at that's happening. That would be my response to that.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks a lot, Tafazo. I don't know if colleagues, if there are any questions, comments. I see Godfrey. Go ahead, Godfrey.
Thank you very much, Doug, for your presentation. Am I audible, Chair?
Yes, you are.
Oh, thank you. So I just wanted to pick your brain in terms of how you relate cricket vis-a-vis the idea of Mugabe as a metaphor of politics in Zimbabwe. And given what has happened, what happened during the liberation struggle with reference to Mugabe, I'm not sure if the relationship between Mugabe and the whites, so to say, then started after independence, Mugabe trying to court the white population through cricket. And that might give us some sort of a problem, because if we are to read closely what Enrique Lett and Dennis Anderson in their writing on the brutal state, and how Mugabe find himself in the hands of the whites, then escorted by the white regime themselves to Mozambique, rather than what we hear about Tangwena, the miraculous escape with Tekere. So I'm inviting you to pay close attention to that relationship, that in fact, the relationship between Mugabe and the white population was not instrumentalized by cricket as a game, but rather Mugabe had already established a relationship, a much more stronger relationship than instrumentalization of cricket. So for me, I would rather try to utilize cricket not as an invitation to politics, but rather cricket as one of those spaces which Mugabe had just to approach cautiously. With or without cricket, Mugabe had already find himself, or already find his feet within the white population then, and his different visits to the UK then to after the fall of General Peter Walls. So I think we may need to reflect much more deeper into that, rather than romanticizing cricket as a space in which Mugabe then find politics with the white population. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you,
Okay.
Godfrey. Yes, Tafazo, I don't know if you want to respond to that. Or maybe
Yes, I want one. Yeah, thank you so much, Godfrey, for your observation. So the crux of my argument is not that Mugabe used cricket to establish relations with the white people. No, I say that cricket was part of a broader process of political performance, which was intended to present a picture of a leader that is tolerant to Western interests. And because cricket was unique in the sense that it was a sport that was predominantly white, him associating with cricket assisted in crafting this image of a gentleman, considering the rhetoric during the Cold War. Remember, Mugabe's background is Marxist socialism. His party, ZANU, is sponsored by Maoist China, and there was this kind of anti-communist ideology that existed in the world during that time. So what I would think was happening here was, this was all part of the politics of the Cold War. What the British particularly would want was a leader who was not communist, a leader who was accommodative to their interests. So I think Mugabe fitted that particular picture, and cricket contributed to that particular image of being a leader who could speak English well, a leader who could dine and wine with the colonizers, who would not be rhetorically against British values and culture. So cricket also played an important role. But also during the premiership of John Major, after Margaret Thatcher, because the end of the Cold War in 1991 created a new sense of political realities. During the Cold War, these newly independent African countries were sought after by the West. But after the Cold War, the world became unipolar in terms of the geopolitical organization of the world. So there was need for establishment of relationships. And the unique thing about cricket is that John Major, who came after Margaret Thatcher, also loved cricket. He was a cricket fan. And because of that, there was a deliberate use of cricket to John Major and give this impression that no, even if the Cold War is ended, our relationship is still very much important. Because this relationship was not just a political relationship, it was also an economic relationship. Because through connection with Britain and the West, they would have access to aid, economic support. So cricket was also very critical. It played a critical role during the major premiership. But after the removal of the Conservatives from power in 1997 and the coming in of the Labour government and the changing of the political circumstances, it was no longer politically pragmatic to sustain cricket as a white enclave. That's why there was this attempt to try and indigenize it, to try and abandon prior performance sought to preserve cricket as this social enclave, to then try and indigenize it, to try and attach it to the post-2000, post-fast-track land reform program, broader political rhetoric that emphasized on anti-colonialism and on what. But let me be quick to say that this was not wholly a uniform process. Because if you look at Kirsty Coventry, for instance, she had successes, the swimmer, she had successes in 2004 Olympics in Athens and successes in 2008 in Beijing and successes in London where she won the 100 meters backstroke. You'd realize that this into sporting success to score political goals continue, because Mugabe himself gave gifts to Kirsty Coventry and famously referred to her as our golden girl. So the same Mugabe who was fighting against the white commercial farmers and labeling them, trying to label whiteness as being against his political rhetoric, is the same who is embracing Kirsty Coventry. So there is this idea of trying sport to gain political mileage. It's not really about sport itself. It's about using sport politically, depending on the political convenience. That's how I would respond to that important contribution.
Yeah, thanks, Tafazo. I see Oba King and then Godfrey after that. I think Godfrey wants to respond. I think this will be our last round of questions. So Oba King and Godfrey in that order.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm not sure if I'm audible enough.
Yes, you are.
Yes. No, thank you very much, Dr. Choto, for insightful presentation. I think what the presentation really gives us is that President Mugabe shown, I will say, an extreme ideological capitulation, especially when he got into power. And even after the challenges on land reform, where there were sanctions imposed on Zimbabwe, also his stance also changed. So there has been a recurring instances of ideological capitulation that really is premised on political expediency. And that's what constantly characterized our political economy, not only in Zimbabwe, but also in South Africa. I mean, you see with the erstwhile presidency of Jacob Zuma, when he was getting out of power, he instituted, political expedient decisions like the free education and all of that. So there's a tendency with ideological capitulation by our politicians or our so-called revolutionaries. But I'm more interested on what the Mugabe regime did after the black bands and the flower put on themselves as a protest to the political situation in Zimbabwe. What were the action taken against such political spectacle done by Olonga and the flower? And lastly, there's an issue, when you speak of how cricket tend to reflect or mirror the political situation, particularly the class issue, because cricket has been perceived as an elite sport. I think Mugabe also reassert that it's a gentleman or a civilizing agent. But what was the sociological implications of this political decision by Mugabe to use cricket as a political, instrument to lure the West into Zimbabwe as this progressive country? Like sociologically, like socially, because I think he was trying to bridge the gap between the elite and the townships and those previously disadvantaged to present this fictitious social cohesion of Zimbabwe to the West. But was that really achieved at the communal level, where the sports now became representative of everyone, because I mean, yeah, what were the class implications of this transformation that came later, even before that? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Obakeng. Godfrey, go ahead.
Thank you. So I'm still trying to figure out how much the British, so to say, with reference to the white population, how much the white population had to do in order to convince Robert Mugabe so that they can have what you call both the economic and the political relations. But what we remember is that there was a price paid already by the British then during the liberation struggle. I will tell you why. So when Robert Mugabe was then escorted from prison in 1975, going to Mozambique, escorted by the special branch, it is alleged that Mugabe was already politically, he was already purchased while in prison because he was detained then. And on his way to Mozambique, when he was in Mozambique, then he couldn't even stay with the then liberation fighters in Mozambique. And he spent a year then at Kuliman. And while at Kuliman, the British then had to pay a huge amount of money in development, so-called development aid to Samora Machel, about 15 million then pounds. This was all in order to save Robert Mugabe and the destruction of the Vashanti then in 1977. So my argument is that there was no need to kind of quote again Mugabe in the post-independence, because Mugabe was already the British man, so to say. So I think we may need a broader conversation that cricket was not the main thing that would then help to make this relationship. But I understand you that you are trying to say that what you need to understand is that cricket was one of those. But your argument does not seem to be like it is one of those. Like cricket is the main thing that then brought Mugabe with these men to understand Mugabe and Mugabe to make relations with them. But Mugabe was already purchased during the liberation struggle. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Godfrey. Maybe I think I'll just throw in the last one, Tafadzwa. This will be the last before you respond. I sort of want to feed on to what Obakeng is highlighted, and I was just thinking also around notions of civility and class, and how these are sort of reproduced in the post-colonial society. So here you have a very ideologically politicized Mugabe who is very anti-colonial, but at the same time, you see that very same figure sort of framing cricket as a very civilized sport of gentlemen. And we see the use of these notions of class, status, and civility. But at the same time, I think we also see these ideological contradictions manifesting in the ways in which Mugabe interacted with cricket. So I just wanted to also understand from you to say, how do we make sense of these ideological tensions and contradictions, apart from political accommodation? In what ways do we also see this kind of ideological contradiction that Mugabe embodied as someone who is very anti-colonial, Marxist, but at the same time reproducing some form of maybe colonial and racial hegemony. In what way do we see or do we make sense of this kind of contradiction? So I think you can respond to those three submissions, and then I think we can call it a day after that.
Okay, thank you so much, Prof. Thank you so much, all those who have raised their issues. I think the first question regarding what happened after the 2003 protest, Black Ambed protest by the two cricketers. What happened is that there was a targeting of Olonga. Actually, Olonga wrote a book about that. He was targeted by the political functionaries of the regime. And in one statement, the then Minister of Information, Jonathan Moyo, labeled him a black man in white skin. Now that's quoting Fanon, the post-colonial theorist, who was trying to argue how colonialism creates these black indigenous people who adopt colonial culture and try to perpetuate it. So this whole idea was situated in this idea that no, Olonga is being used by these neo-colonialists to perpetuate an agenda of neo-colonialism. This was also the political response to the MDC, which we alluded to earlier. It was alluded to as a party that's representing, that is, neo-colonial intentions. So the MDC was actually a form of preserving the gains of the liberation struggle and independence. So cricket, the fight against white dominance in cricket became part of this broader process of independence, okay, which was also the same ideological justification behind the first land reform program. So this was the political processes, but the impact in terms of the game is that we see these inexperienced players who are then coming in to take place of these paged white experienced players. The process was rapid. There was no really conscientious, deliberate process. And because of that, the development of the game was negatively affected. But political issues were prioritized more than the sport itself, because it was not really about the development of the sport. It was using the sport for political purposes. So that's how I would respond to that. Now, concerning the question regarding how Mugabe's understanding of cricket as a civilizing agent, did it cascade to the communal level? Did it make the game more inclusive, or did it make the ordinary Zimbabwean in the township have opportunities to play cricket? No, it did not. There was no serious investment in cricket to try and redistribute it, to try and make it more inclusive. Takashinga was the only club that accommodated black people who would want to be cricketers. And there were a lot of clubs that were predominantly white. So what happened was that, for the sake of political convenience, cricket was just left as it was in the colonial period. A racially exclusive sport that was controlled mostly by white administrators. Even if you read Olonga himself, he would speak about how it was very difficult for a black person to make it through the cricket structures. So this colonial racism was reproduced and maintained for political purposes, because there was this idea that, okay, we need to maintain these social enclaves so as to present a picture of political tolerance, political progress, etc. So the game itself did not develop as it ought to have developed because there was this racial exclusion that was maintained. And as I said, this speaks to what Baba says about some continuities that exist between the colonial and the post-colonial period. These continuities emanate from the fact that the post-colonial state is a kind of a hybrid state. And because it is a kind of a hybrid state, it is in a state of tension and a continuous state of instability. So the post-colonial state faced itself with various competing interests. Will Mugabe pursue the route of Nyerere? Will he pursue the route of Kaunda, or would he try to chart his own path to try and accommodate these tensions that came as a result of the political situation of being a post-colonial state? So I think what prevailed was political pragmatism at the expense of the development of the game of cricket. Not only cricket, but other sports as well. For example, hockey itself, tennis. There was no serious investment in trying in regards to sports development. Sport was mostly perceived from a political perspective. Now, you could also argue that this is also the same with other aspects like gender, for example. Chiweshe and Badasara also make the same argument concerning gender, whereby, well, the regime is not really interested in gender equality, but it's interested in gender equality for the sake of political purposes, but it sustains the very systems that it does not confront the very systems that sustain gender inequality. So we could also say the same towards cricket in both phases that we have been discussing about. Now, concerning the ideological tension that emerged, I think sport itself has got this embedded in sport attentions, because sport is a site of social mobilization, but it is also a site of social exclusion. If you look at studies about sports fandom, how sport is used as a political tool, it has always this, it is this try to a double-edged function. Even in the colonial era, sport was both a form of trying to entrench social control, but at the same time, it's a platform for resisting political control. So because of this ambiguity that comes with this ambivalence that is associated with sport itself as a cultural form, I think these tensions were bound to happen, these ideological tensions, because yes, cricket is a British sport. It's really associated with British mannerisms, British ideals, and embracing that presents a contradiction with the anti-colonial rhetoric that one would purport. But also, there are also political advantages that emerge from embracing cricket. So because of these tensions, the tensions between the ideology as well as what ended up winning was the political benefit that emerged from embracing cricket. That's how I would characterize Mugabe's resolving of these tensions that came because of that. Now, concerning the question about did cricket really help establish relations with the British? The argument is that the relationship with Britain had already existed. So cricket cannot then come in and establish something. Yes, there is some credence to that argument, because if you look at the political situation prior to independence, the Harold Wilson government, both the first phase and the second phase, they were pro. I mean, Labour was left. They were left wing, and they were really pro-African independence. For instance, when Harold Wilson visited Rhodesia in 1965, he actually government did not want him to see the African nationalists. He actually demanded to see Nkomo and the imprisoned nationalists and Sitole then to see them in person. And it is said that he demanded that if he be not allowed to access them, then he would not meet Ian Smith. That's the extent to which the British, the Harold Wilson government respected the African nationalists. So yes, there was this attempt to try and champion the causes of African nationalism because it politically aligned with Harold Wilson's left-wing political leanings. But British politics was not always left-wing. There were also periods whereby there were conservative governments. For instance, the government of Edward Heath and the government of Margaret Thatcher. Thatcher is very critical because it was Thatcher who managed to who had to be convinced actually by the fellow Commonwealth countries to convene the Lusaka Conference, which then facilitated the Lancaster House Conference in 1979. So I think the argument, we need to avoid simplistic arguments that try and portray the British as having a similar political ideology, how they deal with this issue. There are marked differences between the way Thatcher and Harold Wilson dealt with the issue of Zimbabwe, with the issue of Rhodesia then. But what is important for the purposes of this presentation is the fact that a relationship indeed existed between the British and Mugabe when Zimbabwe attained its independence. But that same relationship did not exist between Mugabe and the white Rhodesians, because the white Rhodesians had lived under a right-wing Smith government whose propaganda had portrayed Mugabe as a Marxist guerrilla whose aim is to nationalize and chase away the whites once they get independence. And there was an attempt to try and reverse the flight of white capital. That is the Rhodesians, who the white settlers themselves. And so in associating with cricket, one of their pastimes, of course, there are a lot of things that he attempted. It was a genuine attempt, in my perspective, to try to portray this picture of a person who is a gentleman, a person who you can do business with, whom you can negotiate with. And there's no reason why we would suddenly abandon the country and go to South Africa because the Marxists are coming, the radical communists are coming. Maybe it was an attempt to try and present a picture contra to the propaganda that was being presented by the Smith regime during the Rhodesian Bush War. But I think it's an issue that we could explore further and discuss. But my overall argument here is that cricket as a colonial cultural form was useful politically at independence. And Robert Mugabe utilized it to try and present this picture of a tolerant statesman who could do business with the whites and the West for the sake of political and economic gain. But after the 2000 and the political system, the political environment had shifted, cricket was transformed from an enclave to be preserved to an enclave to be purged. And there was this transformation. Behind all these developments was political pragmatism, the idea to use cricket not for the sense of it as a development, to develop the game, but to gain political mileage. So that would summarize my presentation. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Tafazo, for that fascinating talk. I know we are way over time, but I think that speaks to the interesting nature of your talk. And I think you could see that maybe this was a convergence of political and economic interests on both ends, where in as much as maybe the British colonialists would frame and accept Mugabe's framing of himself as a gentleman because of his close association with sports, but at the same time, maybe turning a blind eye on the atrocities maybe that were committed almost at the same time in Matabeleland and the Midlands province, but also even later on the material realities of political violence, of the violent land reform program, economic crisis, and as well as the human rights violations that then followed. So I think it's interesting, and I also found the response to the cricket players' protest also very, very fascinating, especially from the minister framing these cricket players, as black men in white skin, maybe with particular reference to Henry Olonga. And I think that also has very interesting questions on notions of citizenship. And I think that's the claim that Olonga also made in his book, that at some point he became stateless after that particular protest, that his citizenship was almost held in abeyance after that political act, that symbolic political act. But it was actually interesting in how they framed these people as using the Fanonian lens, as the black men with white masks, and not necessarily doing the same for Mugabe, who took a very totally different approach with his contemporaries. You talked about Nkrumah, Mugabe spending time with Nkrumah, Kaunda, Nyerere, who actually took a very strong anti-colonial stance, and also associating themselves with maybe the sport that they refer to as the sport of the masses. And then Mugabe associated with cricket, which he framed as, a gentleman's game, and therefore reproducing maybe this colonial supremacist with notions of civility, where cricket was then used as the yardstick to measure, the level of civility, the class, the eliteness. So I think these are very interesting issues and interesting conversations. And I think we can actually draw maybe some parallels with Mandela after 94, especially with maybe reference to rugby and also cricket. So thank you very much, Tafazwa. It's really fascinating, and I really appreciate you making time to have this conversation with us and learning from your work, and we'll definitely call you again in the future to learn more from how this work develops. And colleagues, we've stayed up to the very end, and those that have left for other commitments, we thank you for also making time and for engaging. So we really appreciate that, and do enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much, Tafazwa. I really appreciate, and thank you very much for sharing your work with us.
Thank you.
All right, colleagues, thank you very much, and do enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Tafazwa. Bye-bye.
And for those that might want to be invited for our future workshops, if you maybe want to share your emails, I would be happy to put you on our mailing list. And I would also try to share the recordings of our sessions for those that might be interested. So thank you very much, colleagues, and enjoy the rest of your day.